founders Marcus and Joni Lamb from 2007 to 2011. And in that role, she saw up close and personal not just what happened at Daystar TV, but also within the Lamb family. And when these allegations came out...
What if everything you thought you knew about Daystar wasn't the full story? In a stunning twist, julieroys has blown the lid off secrets Joni Lamb never wanted the world to see. The revelations are raw, shocking, and already sending shockwaves through the faith community. Viewers are asking, how deep does this go? And what else has been buried under the surface? This isn't just a scandal. It's a reckoning that could change Daystar forever. Joni Lamb's sudden resignation from Daystar hit like a lightning bolt, leaving even her closest supporters stunned. For years she had been the steady presence at the network, the woman who carried on after Marcus Lamb's passing, and the face that millions of viewers associated with faith, strength, and continuity. That's why, when the announcement dropped, it didn't feel like a natural transition or the quiet retirement of a ministry leader. It felt abrupt, almost like the floor had been pulled out from under the organization. The timing was what really got people talking. Just days before, investigative journalist julieroys had released a bombshell report that peeled back layers of Daystar's operations, questioning not just finances, but the very integrity of its leadership. It wasn't vague criticism or rumor. It was a carefully documented investigation that made people stop and wonder if what they had trusted for so long was not what it seemed. Joni had weathered storms before. She had faced gossip about her personal life, questions about her quick remarriage after Marcus's death, and criticisms about the network's wealth. But this was different. julieroys had a reputation for digging deep, for exposing what others tried to keep hidden, and her track record made it hard to dismiss her work as just noise. To many, Joni's sudden exit felt like confirmation that the report had struck a nerve. Supporters rushed to defend her, saying she was stepping aside to protect the ministry from distractions, but critics saw it as the first crack in a carefully constructed image. Behind the headlines was a sense of betrayal. For decades, Daystar had been more than just a TV network. It was a spiritual lifeline for many, a place where viewers felt connected to God and part of a larger family of faith. Joni's departure, tied so closely to Roys's revelations, made that family feel shaken. Was everything they had believed in now under question? Was the leader they trusted hiding more than she had admitted? Those questions spread fast, not just in church circles but across social media, fueling debates that grew more heated by the hour. For Joni, leaving may have seemed like the only choice, a way to cut the bleeding before the controversy consumed everything. But the silence surrounding her reasons only added to the mystery. Instead of clarity, her absence created a vacuum filled with speculation, whispers, and doubt. What had once been a story about a trusted ministry leader carrying her husband's legacy was now a story of suspicion, investigation, and fallout. julieroys had lit the match, but Joni's sudden exit was the explosion that made everyone realize just how fragile the foundation had become. When the controversy between julieroys and Joni Lamb erupted, it wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the meeting of two completely different worlds, two opposing ways of seeing the role of faith, leadership, and accountability. On one side stood julieroys, the investigative journalist known for digging where others were afraid to look, never hesitating to confront big names in Christian circles. On the other side was Joni Lamb, the longtime face of Daystar, who for years had presented herself as a loyal wife, a devoted servant of God, and a woman determined to carry on her late husband's vision. Both women were strong, influential, and determined. But when their stories collided, the impact shook the Christian community.
We got back from our honeymoon. It was in July. And by the way, there are questions about, it's all over the internet, that Daystar paid $100,000 for my
Yes,
honeymoon.
I was getting ready to ask you about that.
So, absolutely not. Not one penny of Daystar's money was used for our honeymoon. We paid for our honeymoon, okay? So, again, that's another lie that's out there.
julieroys had built her career on asking hard questions. She had exposed financial mismanagement in ministries, abuse of power in Christian organizations, and misconduct by leaders who seemed untouchable. Her work was not about tearing people down for sport. She often emphasized that her mission came from a place of faith, that truth and accountability mattered because they honored God. Yet, her style was sharp, her words blunt, and her investigations detailed. For those in power, she was a nightmare. For For the ordinary believer who had felt betrayed by leaders, she was a voice of justice. She didn't let emotion or reputation stop her from pursuing facts, and that often made her enemies in the very world she was trying to protect. Joni Lamb represented something very different. For decades, she had been seen as a stabilizing figure in Christian broadcasting. Alongside her husband Marcus, she co-founded Daystar, which grew into one of the largest Christian television networks in the world. Millions tuned in to watch its programs, hear its preachers, and feel part of a global family of faith. Joni was known for her warm presence, her ability to connect with viewers, and her commitment to building Daystar's reach. After Marcus's death, she carried the mantle alone, stepping fully into the spotlight as both a grieving widow and a leader tasked with holding the network together. To many of her supporters, Joni wasn't just a broadcaster. She was a spiritual figure who represented endurance, faith, and the belief that God had called her to continue Marcus's mission. But the cracks began to show. Allegations about Daystar's finances, questionable decisions, and the personal choices of Joni herself started to surface. Julieroys, true to form, began to investigate. She dug into the claims, spoke to insiders, and published reports that pulled back the curtain on the network's operations. Her findings painted a picture that many didn't want to believe. Donations being questioned, extravagant purchases like private jets being justified under the banner of ministry, and blurred lines between personal wealth and nonprofit resources. To Julie, these were red flags that demanded accountability. To Joni, they were attacks, meant to discredit her and the ministry she had poured her life into. When Julie's reports gained traction, the collision was inevitable. Joni defended herself fiercely, going public with statements, interviews, and emotional appeals. She framed the controversy as a spiritual battle, insisting that the accusations were lies and that the ministry was under attack by forces trying to divide the church. Her words resonated with many of her loyal viewers who saw her as a victim of unfair scrutiny. They believed Julieroys was not helping the church, but harming it, tearing down a ministry that had brought hope and faith to millions. This divide highlighted the very different worlds these two women came from. Julie lived in the world of journalism, where truth is measured by evidence, documents, and accountability. Joni lived in the world of faith broadcasting, where image, loyalty, and spiritual framing shaped the narrative. Julie's tools were facts and investigations. Joni's tools were faith-driven testimonies and emotional connection. And when those worlds collided, the result was chaos. Supporters of Julieroys praised her for being brave enough to speak truth to power. They pointed to past scandals in other ministries and argued that without journalists like her, wrongdoing would go unchecked. They saw her as a modern-day prophet, calling out corruption within the church, just as biblical prophets had called out leaders who strayed from God's commands. Her work, they argued, was not divisive but necessary, a painful process that ultimately led to purification and reform. Supporters of Joni, however, felt very differently. To them, Julie's style was destructive. They believed she focused only on tearing down leaders, rather than building up the church. They accused her of seeking attention, of using the failures of others to make a name for herself. Joni's defenders pointed to her years of ministry, her charitable works, and her role in carrying on Marcus's legacy as proof of her sincerity. They argued that whatever mistakes had been made, she was still a servant of God, and tearing her down meant tearing down the faith of those who looked up to her. The clash became more than personal. It became symbolic. It reflected a broader conflict within modern Christianity, the tension between protecting leaders and ministries for the sake of unity and holding them accountable for the sake of integrity. Julie and Joni became the faces of this conflict, embodying two opposing philosophies that had long existed but rarely collided so publicly. The media only amplified this tension. Headlines cast Julie as the relentless watchdog and Joni as the embattled leader. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags, debates, and heated arguments breaking out in comment sections. Some accused Joni of hypocrisy, pointing to her remarriage and financial controversies. Others accused Julie of cruelty, saying she was exploiting personal pain for headlines. Both women became lightning rods, attracting passionate defense and sharp criticism in equal measure. What made the clash even more intense was that both women were, in their own ways, sincere. Julie truly believed that accountability was essential to honoring God and protecting the faithful. Joni truly believed that her ministry was being unfairly attacked and that she had a divine calling to continue despite the criticism. Neither saw herself as the villain. Each was convinced she was doing the right thing. That sincerity only deepened the divide as their supporters mirrored their convictions and dug in further. The result was not just a controversy over Daystar, but a much bigger conversation about the role of leadership, wealth, and transparency in Christian ministries. Could a ministry own private jets and mansions and still be seen as faithful to God's mission? Should investigative journalists be embraced as guardians of truth or rejected as divisive forces? Was Joni Lamb a victim of unfair attacks, or had she been shielded from accountability for too long? In the end, the collision of Julieroys and Joni Lamb was more than just a scandal. It was a moment of reckoning for the church community. It forced believers to wrestle with uncomfortable questions and to decide where they stood on issues of money, leadership, and truth. For some, it was a painful wake-up call. For others, it was an unfair attack on someone they admired. But for everyone watching, it was a reminder that even in the world of faith, the truth cannot stay hidden forever. The story of Daystar and Joni Lamb took a darker turn when allegations began to surface that went beyond the usual whispers of criticism and straight into questions about money, luxury, and honesty. For years, Daystar had been presented as a place of faith, a network built to spread the gospel, bring hope to homes, and connect believers across the world. Joni Lamb, especially after the death of her husband Marcus, positioned herself as the steady hand keeping that mission alive. But when reports started pointing to questionable financial decisions, particularly the purchase of a private jet, the trust that so many viewers had given began to crack. At first, the idea of a ministry owning a jet might have seemed like a practical detail. After all, Daystar's programs reached dozens of countries, and the Lamb family traveled constantly. Joni defended the choice by saying it was necessary for the work of the ministry. Flying commercial, she argued, was not always realistic for the demands of global broadcasting. To her supporters, this explanation made sense. To her critics, however, it sounded like the same justification used by many televangelists who had long blurred the line between ministry and personal luxury. A jet, after all, is not a cheap tool. It is a symbol, and that symbol raised uncomfortable questions about what was really being prioritized. The mission of spreading the gospel, or the comfort of its leaders? The jet was only the beginning. As more details came out, people began to look harder at the financial practices inside Daystar. Julieroys' investigations fueled much of this new scrutiny, pointing to the lack of transparency in how donations were being handled. Viewers who had sent in money with faith-filled hearts started to wonder, was their generosity really funding ministry, or was it paying for luxury? It didn't help when stories emerged of donors, often elderly or struggling financially, giving far more than they could afford because they were promised blessings in return. One former employee recalled the heartbreaking moment of taking a phone call during a fundraising event from a woman who had nothing left but a small line of credit on her card. She donated anyway, believing the words of the broadcaster who promised God would return her gift tenfold. Stories like that cut deep and shook confidence in the ministry's integrity. The fallout spread quickly. For supporters who had believed in Joni for years, these revelations felt personal. Daystar wasn't just another TV channel, it was part of their spiritual life, a trusted companion in times of need. Hearing that money might have been misused or that extravagances like private jets were being purchased felt like a betrayal. Faith is built on trust, and when trust breaks, it often leaves deeper wounds than any other kind of disappointment. Joni tried to fight back. She went public with emotional defenses, insisting that Daystar's finances were sound and that the accusations were exaggerated or outright false. She framed the criticism as an attack on the ministry, a scheme to discredit the work God had called them to do. She pointed to the good Daystar had done, humanitarian aid, disaster relief, programming that had touched millions, as proof that the heart of the ministry was pure. Her supporters clung to those words, believing that the controversy was little more than an attack from outsiders trying to divide the church. But her critics weren't convinced. The controversy over the jet became a symbol of something much bigger. It wasn't just about one purchase. It was about what it represented. To many, it symbolized the widening gap between the values of humility and service preached on air and the lifestyle that seemed to be happening behind the scenes. It highlighted the tension that always exists when ministries grow into massive organizations with millions of dollars in donations flowing in. The temptation to blur lines, to justify luxuries as tools for ministry, can be strong, But once the public sees those choices, trust can crumble fast. What made this situation even harder was the role of transparency, or the lack of it. Nonprofit organizations, especially ministries, are expected to handle money with care and openness. Donors want to know that their sacrifice is being used wisely. When questions are met with vague answers or defensiveness, suspicion only grows. Daystar's responses, while passionate, often left more questions than answers. Instead of putting the matter to rest, they fueled the perception that something was being hidden. As the story grew, the media seized on it, turning Daystar's jet and financial practices into national headlines. Suddenly, Joni wasn't just the grieving widow carrying her husband's vision. She was the face of a scandal. Every defense she gave was picked apart, every decision put under a microscope. For some viewers, it was too much to bear, and they quietly stepped away, withdrawing donations or changing the channel. For others, it was a rallying cry to stand by her, seeing the entire ordeal as spiritual warfare designed to silence her ministry. But in the middle of the arguments and headlines, the most important piece of the story was often the people who had given, prayed, and trusted. They were the ones left wondering if their faith had been taken advantage of. For those who had given their last dollars believing they were sowing into God's work, the idea that the money might have been tied up in luxury instead of ministry was devastating. That broken trust doesn't heal easily. The saga of allegations, jets, and broken trust became a defining chapter in Joni Lamb's leadership of Daystar. It wasn't just a financial scandal. It was a spiritual crisis. The decisions made by leaders were being weighed not only in courts of law or public opinion, but in the hearts of ordinary believers who had once believed without hesitation. Whether or not Daystar survives the damage, the lesson has already been written. In the world of faith and media, the line between serving God and serving self must never be blurred, because when trust is lost, it rarely returns. When the storm around Daystar and Joni Lamb finally reached its peak, what followed was not just shock, but a long period of fallout, reflection, and hard questions that refused to go away. For years, Daystar had been one of the most trusted names in Christian broadcasting. Viewers tuned in faithfully, sent in donations, and believed deeply in the mission that Marcus and Joni Lamb had laid out. But when the scandals broke about finances, luxury spending, and questions of honesty, the trust that had been carefully built over decades cracked in ways that may never fully heal. The fallout started with viewers. Some of the most loyal supporters, people who had prayed with Daystar through late nights and shared testimonies of how the network had changed their lives, began to doubt. They weren't just upset about a jet or the rumors of misused funds. They were heartbroken over the possibility that their sacrifices, the dollars they gave when they didn't have much to spare, might not have gone where they thought. One of the deepest wounds came from the realization that faith had been tied to money in ways that felt manipulative. Promises that giving a certain amount would bring blessings, or that sowing into the ministry would bring a harvest. For many, this no longer felt like hope. It felt like exploitation. At the same time, others defended Joni fiercely. They pointed out her years of dedication, her resilience after Marcus's death, and the good works Daystar had supported around the world. Disaster relief, humanitarian aid, medical missions. They argued that every ministry faces attacks and that no leader is perfect. To them, the criticism was a distraction from the bigger mission of spreading the gospel. This divide created tension not just among viewers, but within church communities, as congregations and pastors debated whether the allegations were a sign of corruption or simply the cost of leading such a large ministry. The reflection that followed was harder and more personal. It forced many believers to ask themselves uncomfortable questions about trust, money, and the role of media in their faith. Why do so many ministries grow so large and so wealthy? How do leaders who preach about humility and sacrifice end up living lifestyles that look more like celebrities than servants? And why do so many followers, even in the face of troubling revelations, continue to give unquestioningly? These were not just questions about Daystar. They were questions about the modern church as a whole. For those inside the ministry world, the scandal was a wake-up call. Leaders realized that transparency was no longer optional. In an age of social media and instant news, any hint of secrecy or dishonesty could spread in seconds and damage reputations permanently. Ministries began looking at their structures, their boards, and their accountability systems, asking whether they were strong enough to prevent the kind of trust crisis Daystar was facing. The bigger picture was clear. Without openness and integrity, no ministry, no matter how big, could survive the scrutiny of a modern audience. The media's role also became part of the reflection. Julie Royce's reporting played a central role in bringing many of these issues to light. Some saw her as a necessary truth teller, someone willing to ask questions that too many were afraid to raise. Others accused her of being divisive, of tearing down instead of building up. But whether people agreed with her or not, her work highlighted the growing need for accountability within Christian organizations. It proved that no leader, no matter how beloved, should be beyond questioning. As the dust settled, the bigger picture came into focus. The Daystar controversy wasn't just about Joni Lamb or a private jet. It was about what happens when faith, money, and power collide. It showed the fragility of trust in ministry and how quickly it can vanish when actions don't align with words. It revealed how easily generosity can be twisted into guilt or obligation, and how damaging that can be when exposed. Most of all, it reminded everyone, leaders, followers, and outsiders looking in, that the message of faith is too important to be clouded by scandals of wealth and secrecy. For Joni, the fallout has been deeply personal. She remains a polarizing figure, with some still supporting her and others feeling betrayed beyond repair. For Daystar, the challenge is survival, not just financially, but spiritually, as the network tries to rebuild its reputation in a world that will never see it quite the same way again. And for the larger Christian community, the reflection continues. Churches and ministries are being forced to think carefully about how they handle money, how they communicate with supporters, and how they balance influence with humility. In the end, the bigger picture goes beyond one ministry or one leader. It's about the constant tension in the church between human weakness and spiritual ideals. People want to believe in leaders who are larger than life, but they are also reminded, time and again, that those leaders are human and humans fail. The real test is how the church responds, not by covering up or making excuses, but by committing to honesty, accountability, and a renewed focus on the heart of the gospel. That is the only way to heal the broken trust left in the wake of Daystar's crisis.